Achievement for Missouri Preservation. She is the author of 5 books and many scholarly articles in popular journals. Her book, From French Community to Missouri Town, St. Genevieve in the 19th Century, has been very instrumental to us here in St. Genevieve. It was published in 2006. It won the 2007 Book Award from the Missouri Conference on History. Recently, she drafted, as you heard Bob on the luncheon presentation, the significance and context statements for our application to the National Park Service for a French Quarter National Park here in the St. Genevieve area. So without further ado, I give you Bonnie Stepenoff.
Thank you. I'm going to use the microphone. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Bob, are you going to?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. All right. Okay. Thank you. I'm really happy to be here to talk about. Since I drafted that significance and context statement for the National Park Service, I had to go and look at all the national landmark quality properties in St. Genevieve, and I looked again at the known and recognized French vertical log houses in St. Genevieve, and of course was more and more impressed with this great legacy. And I started to wonder about the men who, and I assume it was men, who actually built these houses, and that this legacy has been connected to the people who occupied the houses, which is important, but I wanted to try and connect these houses, especially the ones that survive, although I have a little bit of information about a house in Old Town, in Old St. Genevieve, but I wanted to find out about the Carpenters and the house joiners who were working in St. Genevieve during the period when these vertical log houses were built. Just find out about their lives and how they worked, and maybe try to connect them up with particular properties, but that proved to be pretty difficult. So I have basically 2 points to make here. One is that we need to recognize the craftsmen who built these houses, and number 2, I have wondered, and other people have wondered, and Bob and I talked about this a little bit last night, about the fact that these craftsmen, or the people in St. Genevieve, kept building and occupying these houses after the Louisiana Purchase, after what we call the French period in history, in their history. And so, and I think that the key to that fact is that these craftsmen, carpenters and house joiners, continue to live in St. Genevieve and continue to build in their traditional ways, even after the government changed and after the population changed to different ethnic makeup. So those are the 2 points I want to address, and I also want to talk a little bit, and I'll keep it fairly short. I want to talk a little bit about a few of these carpenters and house joiners that I was able to find information on in the St. Genevieve archives. Okay. First of all, there were several flurries of activity of building vertical log houses. And I'm judging this by, of course, the numbers of houses that have survived from that period. But I do want to mention the 1750s, roughly the 1750s, the time of the founding of the old town of St. Genevieve, the one that had to move away from the river. So there was some house building, of course, that went on at that time. And then after the flood of 1785, the people of St. Genevieve moved their households to higher ground farther away from the river to New St. Genevieve. And so there's a flurry of house building that went on in the 1790s, and several houses survived from that period. Another period in which there were numerous vertical log houses built was 1800 to 1808, around the time of the Louisiana Purchase when there was an influx of people. But it's interesting to note that although there was an influx of English-speaking people, there was also a burst of activity building vertical log houses in the French style. In the 1820s, the early period of Missouri statehood, there was a flurry of building, and then the last few vertical log houses that survive date from roughly 1840 to 1846. So it just kind of underscores the point that these houses continued to be built after the American period was over. Now, what I tried to do, since I'd worked on this significance and context statement, I had created a list of the surviving vertical log houses by date, and I realized that not every date is rock solid, but basically I was able to divide them into these periods. And so the next step that I took was to try and find out who were the carpenters and house joiners who were working in St. Genevieve in those periods, and came up with not a huge list of names, but some names and some interesting characters who were working at those times. There are not very many building contracts that I've been able to find in the St. Genevieve archives. Apparently the St. Louis archives have a lot more of these contracts. But one really interesting survival is a contract from 1770 in which Louis Bolduc hired a man named Louis Boulet to faire une maison, to build a house, a post on a sale construction with galleries. And this contract does mention the word galleries all around. And I'm not going to go into any detail on this because this house does not survive. It was in the old town. But interestingly, in the contract, Louis Bolduc offered to supply all the building materials and to provide 2 men, either slave or free, to work with Louis Boulet to build this house. Now, the assumption is, and I think that, the assumption was that the 2 men supplied by Bolduc would only work when they weren't needed in the field. So that's why I think that the completion date for the house was set a year in the future after the contract was signed. They gave them plenty of time to build this house and work around their other schedule of work. I don't know too much about Louis Boulet, but the Louis Bolduc who signed this contract was the same one who later had a house built in the new town of St. Genevieve after the flood of 1785. Now, for this period after the flood, one particular man stood out as a carpenter, was listed as a carpenter in the Spanish census, and his name was Nicolas Caillot de la Chance, and he and his sons, several of his sons, also worked as carpenters. And I don't know a whole lot about him, but one important fact to remember about him is that he was a very substantial citizen with a large amount of property of his own. He owned slaves, he owned real property, and there's a reason for this. Most of these carpenters that I will talk about have substantial means. They're not poor men. They are men with resources, and there is a logical explanation why that would be so, because it took resources to be able to purchase the tools and hire the labor in order to take on these jobs building houses. So Nicolas Caillot de la Chance and his sons had substantial money and property, and they owned slaves. I believe he had 9 sons. Not all of them were carpenters, but he had, in addition to slaves, he had a built-in workforce in his own family, because these buildings, it was very labor intensive. So the labor force, which we talked about a little bit this morning, consisted of, in part, slaves, in part, the sons of craftsmen, and in part, journeymen and apprentices who worked for the craftsmen. And I found instances of all those types of working arrangements. So sometimes the master craftsman would hire laborers as journeymen paid by the day. Sometimes they took on apprentices. Sometimes they either owned slaves or had access to slaves' labor. A few of the houses built in the 1790s include the Amaro House, the Vitel St. Jem Beauvais House, the Bulldog House, John B. Valet House, and the Green Tree Tavern. So I don't know. I can't, at this point, connect Nicolas Caillot de la Chance with any particular house, but he and his sons certainly were likely to be involved in the construction of these important houses. Going on to the next period, the early 1800s, around the time of the Louisiana Purchase, especially after 1806, there was another flurry of house building. Some of the houses from that period include the Aubuchon, La Haye, Bernier, La Chance, Guibord Valet, La Sourstrand, Jean B. Valet II, and the Paquette Rabot House. All those houses date from this period in the early 1800s. And two of the major carpenters and house joiners that I found for this early period, early 19th century period, were Joseph La Chance, who was the son of Nicolas Caillot de la Chance. Most of the children in that family moved on to other places, but Joseph stayed here in St. Genevieve and was employed as a carpenter. Another truly interesting person, probably the most interesting person that I found here in this research, was Michel Badeau, who came to St. Genevieve from Saint-Domingue, from the Caribbean, sometime before 1808 and perhaps around 1806. And I have been able to piece together a lot of his story. So he's the person that I have the most information on. And he also remained in St. Genevieve for several decades after the early 1800s and continued to work as a carpenter, and also his son Henry continued to work as a carpenter. Interestingly enough, there was a man who came from St. Louis, and I was talking to the speaker from this morning about this man, Jean-Marie Pépin de la Chance. La Chance was a kind of a nickname meaning lucky, so this man's surname was Pépin. Jean-Marie Pépin de la Chance, or called La Chance, was a stonemason in colonial St. Louis. He apparently, according to Charles Peterson's study of colonial St. Louis, Jean-Marie Pépin was kind of a political radical and started a sans-culotte society in St. Louis and kind of ticked people off in St. Louis, and so he left St. Louis and he came to St. Genevieve, and he employed carpenters, and among them, the ones he employed as journeymen by the day were Joseph La Chance and Michel Badeau. So Jean-Marie Pépin de la Chance was sort of a contractor who had subcontractors or journeymen working for him, building houses. Now, he left an account book in the St. Genevieve archives, and I found mentions of Joseph La Chance and Michel Badeau in that account book working for Mr. Pépin. And I found their names in connection with the Bernier house. So that's the main one that actually that is there in that account book. listing them with a particular building. However, I'm pretty sure that Michel Badeau also was involved with building the Jacques Guibord house, which many of you saw last night. Because of coincidences in the records, first of all, I do have pretty good data on Badeau. He was born about 1785 in Saint-Domingue. He arrived in St. Genevieve early in the 19th century. I believe he was probably a white man, but I'm not sure. His racial identity is not really documented, but we do know that he married a woman of color. He married a woman of mixed racial heritage, and then his children were identified in the census as being of mixed race. So it was a racially blended family. He had, remember, he came from Saint-Domingue, and also Jacques Guibord came from that area. And there is a connection between their two families, because in I have to check the date, but I think it's 1813, Michel Badeau inherited some money from Francois Badeau. And I'm not sure if that was his father. I'm not sure what the family connection was. But the executor of the will was the widow of Jacques Guibord. So Jacques Guibord had died in 1812, but his widow was the executrix, I think is the word, of this will, in which Francois Badeau left some property to Michel Badeau. So again, we know a lot of things about Michel Badeau. We know he had a racially blended family. We know he inherited property. He had property. He had the means to, buy tools and employ men to build houses. He also, interestingly enough, considering that he had a racially blended family, at one point purchased a slave. He held the slave for about a year or two and then sold the slave. So I don't know if, sometimes I think people purchase slaves in order to free them. So he may have purchased him in order to emancipate him, or he may have used the labor of the slave. I'm not sure on that one. Okay. Okay. After 1810, a couple of other carpenters appear in the records. Michel Badeau, remember, is still active. He's still here in St. Genevieve and active. But another man named Michael Goza appears in the record as a carpenter, and he was a quite successful and prominent man who became a justice of the peace. And so he appears in the records many, many times because he signed lots and lots of documents. But I haven't been able to find out too much about his personal life, although like other carpenters and house joiners, he was a man of property. And he had an apprentice named Antoine de Rocher. He took on an apprentice. And there's a very, very interesting document in the archives. And I have a quote from it next. This document is in the archives. It's a contract or an indenture. Remember the word indentured servants. Indentured servitude, we always hear about it with the Pilgrims and the Jamestown colonists, but indentured servitude really persisted for a very long time in the United States. And in this case, Lawrence de Rocher signed an indenture binding his son Antoine de Rocher to be an apprentice to Michael Goza, and quote, to learn the trade, art, and mystery of a carpenter and house joiner, to live with Goza for 5 years, and during that 5 years to faithfully serve his said master. And apprentices would call their boss, their master, and the apprentices weren't really free to just say, I'm done, take this job. And, they weren't really free to do that. They were bound to a master. So, and also this indenture specified that Michael Goza was to provide food and clothing and proper, adequate lodging for the apprentice Antoine de Rocher. I don't know much more about Antoine de Rocher, but he did apparently learn the trade of carpenter and house joiner, and he continued to live in Ste. Genevieve and became a citizen and householder and served on juries. So he was a substantial citizen of Ste. Genevieve. And just to tell you why this is important, because at the time that Michael Goza and Antoine de Rocher were living and working in Ste. Genevieve, especially in the 1820s, there were several of the surviving and significant vertical log houses built, including the Beauchamp House, two Gobreau houses, the Caron House, the Thomier House, the Seraphim House, and the La Lumandière House. Now, Michael Goza died in 1836, so he may have participated in the building of the houses in the 1820s. None of the houses that survive seem to date from the 1830s, but some do date from the 1840s, and Michael Goza could not have been involved with those. But Antoine de Rocher, Michel Badeau, and Michel Badeau's son Henry continued to live in Ste. Genevieve through the 1840s, when the last of the vertical log houses were constructed. There's an interesting court record having to do with Henry Badeau and Pelagie Amoreau. And Pelagie Amoreau was a woman who lived in the Amoreau house. She was a woman of color, married to a white man, and apparently from documents and also from family records from the Amoreau family, family memories and stories that have been passed down, she was quite a feisty woman. And also, she registered as a free black person. So did Henry Badeau. In the 1830s, Missouri passed a law requiring any black person living as a free person to register and obtain a license from the county clerk. And it's a terrible law, a terrible thing. But those records survive in the county courthouse. So we know that from those records that Henry Badeau was of mixed race. Michel Badeau did not register, so we don't know. So he may have been a white man. And Pelagie registered, and the description of Pelagie indicated that she was a very short, very sort of stocky woman with a defective nose. And we don't know why her nose was defective, but I spoke with some of her descendants, and they believe that somehow she got punched in the nose because she was continually getting in fights with people. And one of those people was Henry Badeau. And so, to make a long story short, in 1845, she took him to court, sued him, and by the way, free black people living in Ste. Genevieve did go to court. They did sue. She sued Henry Badeau and said that he had grabbed her, that he grabbed her and shook her and called her some bad names. But the jury, which was all white, by the way, the jury found in favor of Henry, and actually the jury went on to pretty much call Pelagie some bad names and say she was a bad, immoral woman or something to that effect. So anyway, Henry was vindicated by the jury, but we'll never know really what happened, what truly happened between them. But we do know from that record that Henry Badeau was living in Ste. Genevieve, and we also know he was working as a carpenter, and so was his father in the 1840s when the last of the vertical log houses were constructed. And the ones that survive that date from that period include the Placé house, the Delassus Kern house, and the Auguste Burke house. I call it the Auguste house, but it's better known as the Burke house. So I would say that there's a good chance that they had something to do with the building of those houses. In 1860, Michel Badeau's wife and several of their grandchildren died of cholera. That was one of there were several instances of cholera epidemics during the 19th century that affected St. Louis terribly, but also affected Cape Girardeau. In 1860, the Badeau family was stricken by this cholera epidemic, and after that they moved to St. Louis, and Michel Badeau died in St. Louis in 1876 and received a fairly nice, prominent obituary in the St. Louis papers, which is one reason we know quite a bit about him and his family. So Michel Badeau, I think, probably, it'd be safe to say, had the longest career as a carpenter and house joiner in Ste. Genevieve, was almost certainly involved with the Bernier house and the Guibord Vallée house, and probably other vertical log houses of the period. And I just have one more slide. And to sum up, I just want to say that these men that I've just talked about, these carpenters and house joiners, left an incredible legacy here in Ste. Genevieve, and they're obscure men in that their names are not known, and they generally haven't gone down as, you know, some of the most prominent families in Ste. Genevieve, but during their time, the time when they were living and working here, they were prominent and substantial citizens. They had property, they had a certain amount of social status and respect as craftsmen, and this was, I've read something about, I've been trying to read books about craftsmanship and labor in France during this time period, and during this time period in the 18th and the 19th century, craftsmen, tradesmen, carpenters, joiners in France, although they weren't among generally the elite or the aristocracy, held a high position in society. They had organizations called corporations, but really they were more like guilds in which they supported each other and helped each other obtain work and helped each other to obtain fair treatment from in contracts with employers. And so while I haven't found any evidence of any organized guilds of carpenters and joiners here in Ste. Genevieve, I think they brought with them that legacy that gave them status and position and regard for their craftsmanship. And I think that is indicated in the contract between Lawrence de Rocher and Michael Goza, in which he talks about the sacred art and mysteries of being a house joiner. So although these men haven't gone down in history in any big way, they were prominent, substantial citizens in their time. And I think it's also important, interesting and important to note that some of them were white and some of them were mixed race men, and they still enjoyed this kind of social status that went along with practicing an honored trade. Thank you.
Thank you for watching Channel 798.
Thank you for watching Channel 7 and 98.
Hi, thank you very much for watching Channel 798.